Here beginneth part 3 of the Intelligence Squared debate. The US alliance is Australia's best defence.
Jim gave us a quick rundown of what's been involved in the last 50 years. President Carter says that the US has been involved in over 140 instances of destabilising or destroying legitimate government. So my question is, nobody has told us where any of these threats are coming from. Everybody's skirting around. But the US is clearly in decline. It's clearly not the power it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So why would we hitch our security on a declining power?
Okay, well, first I'll address the issue of U.S. decline because, we've heard this before. We heard this at the start of the Cold War. The story was that Russia's centralized economy was going to overwhelm the U.S. economy. It could never keep up. And in fact, John F. Kennedy, if you listen to the tape recordings, that was the advice he was getting from his advisors. And that proved not to be the case. And then after the Cold War, everyone said the Cold War's over and Germany and Japan have won. And the U.S. has spent its load and it can't keep up. And again, that proved to be wrong. After the global financial crisis, again, the statement was that the U.S. It's in irons, it's a lagging economy, it won't come back. In fact, if you just look at the U.S. economy, 4 years ago, the Dow Jones was at 6,500. Today, it's at over 15,000. If you look at the U.S. economy, every month for the past 36 months, unemployment has been falling and growth has been rising. If you look at, any one of the metrics, we have completely reinvented our economy. We've changed our whole energy mix. So now we have the cheapest gas in the world, and it has created over 500,000 new manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and really built up the U.S. economy. And at the same time, we've reduced our carbon footprint more than any other nation in the world. We are one of the most resilient economies in the world. People move when they need to in order to get jobs. Money flows freely around the United States, and capital finds its most productive purpose. And that's why places like Silicon Valley and all of the things that we take for granted in our lives, the Google and the Facebook and the iPads, and those are all coming out of the United States because of the nature of our economy. So I'm not prepared to say that the U.S. is dead or the U.S. is in decline. I think the evidence, once again, is pointing in just the opposite direction.
That's to be brief, Jeff. There are some other people in too. Just a very brief final point.
Oh, yes. And then on the other point about running around destabilizing legitimate governments, and that it's 100 and something, that's just not true. And I would defy someone to give me that list. And let me just point about where we've done military actions. Usually they are part of peacekeeping forces. I don't think anyone is saying that we destabilized a legitimate government when we went in to save lives in the former Yugoslavia. I don't think anyone is saying that we were involved in destabilizing a legitimate government when we went into Somalia or when we tried to save lives in Rwanda. When these efforts come up, when innocent people are dying, everyone turns to the United States and says, thank goodness you have the forces that you have to save innocent lives and innocent civilians.
My name is Donna McIntosh. I think that history should have taught us that great powers will always work in their own best interests, and therefore we can't depend on America or China or anybody working in our best interest. We need to depend on ourselves. I'm with General Molan on this one. We need to think about what our moral issues are, where we want to go, and not make formal alliances with anyone.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a student from Penrith High, and I would like to know, if we as Australia are free riding on America, what is America seeking to gain from our alliance?
So my name is Timothy Simic from Year 11 from school. With what you're proposing, wanted to clarify, is it really an alliance, or is it more of a factor of reliance? And how would you define the difference between an alliance and a reliance, and what kind of strategies would you have in place to prevent it from turning into reliance?
Okay, is it alliance or reliance?
Fucking go team. Year 11.
How
That's a
appropriate that the
17-year-old
final
kid,
question from
maybe
the floor will come
16.
from a woman at microphone 2? Your name, please.
My name's Sue Wadley. What I wanted to know is, doesn't a US alliance for Australia mean more friends for the US and more enemies for Australia? Don't America's enemies become our enemies?
Okay, thank you.
Fucking hell. Stick it to him.
Okay, well, because of the time, what I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to do is to roll their answers into those series of questions where there's a common theme around alliance versus reliance, the self-interest of nations, and particularly that last question about your enemies becoming our enemies, or the United States enemies. All of those things to be picked up in the final 2-minute summaries that you provide in response. So, now for the final statements. Can I please invite, for 2 minutes, the Ambassador of the United States of America to Australia, Jeff Bleish.
Well, first, Simon, thank you, and thank everyone for very provocative, thoughtful questions.
That is a switched-on 16-year-old.
The alliance has been a source of stability for this region. When people ask what's in it for the United States, peace and stability is in it for the United States. The United States is a very strong, productive country, and the thing that helps us best is if we have partners around the world with whom we can trade, with whom we can work, with whom we understand. We are a nation of immigrants, and having stable countries from which those immigrants come to renew and refresh the United States on a regular basis has been the source of our strength. That's our self-interest, is to work with others and make them strong and stable too. Now, in terms of our alliance, how does that benefit Australia? I think we've made the point, which is that it makes you more capable. It multiplies your influence in the world by virtue of having the strength of the United States by your side where we share values. Now, what I heard from Professor Zhu was that he thinks that the alliance is a good thing, and it's a good thing for Australia. It's a good hedge against a lot of factors. His one concern is that China might overreact to American strength in the region and might make bad decisions. But the way to address that is not by eliminating an alliance that's lasted for over 60 years and that has always, been here throughout the period of the rise. The response is to work more closely together between the U.S. and China, which is precisely what we're doing. What I hear from General Mullen is that, well, it's a good thing, except, if you have this strong a partner by your side, you'll get lazy. That's not going to happen because our two nations, we're democracies. And the U.S. voters aren't going to support our paying all of our hard tax dollars so that others can live off of us and freeload. We have had very honest discussions with our partners around the world. And when you look at the efforts, despite, I think Jim had some great lines in his presentation, that is not what's actually happening. We have capable partners. We work very closely together. And then finally, let me get to this last point, which is that the U.S. only operates in its self-interest and would throw Australia under a bus if there was any divergence in our interests. And it said, look at history. That was the point that struck with me. Look at history. Look at history. I was just up with the Pacific Fleet, and when there was a flood and tsunami and earthquake and then near nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, the people who were there were the Americans. We came in there, we risked our own lives to save the Japanese. When there was a terrible earthquake in Haiti, the very first people on the beach were U.S. Marines, protecting them. We have devoted aid all around the world to support other nations and to support their stability and their peace and their way of life, and to give them an opportunity that they would never have had before. And we have shared our information, we have shared our innovation, we have shared our prosperity, and we have worked in ways that our partners who work most closely with us understand reflects a trust and a genuine affection that has been unknown in human history by any other nation of our size, scale, and power. And so...
But you've just defied my Australian bell.
And so, without further defying the Australian bells, let me just say thank you to Australia for being such good allies, and I hope that we can look forward to another 7 years of the U.S.-Australia alliance and beyond.
Thank you. Professor Zhu Feng, your 2 minutes begins now.
Okay, I think at the end of the day, the debate today also just has never been clearer, because I think there's so many Australian friends keep Mr. Ambassador on the friendly fire and bombarding him with a lot of questions. I think are all evidence about your choice. But anyway, I think the problem is, from the Chinese perspective, as I made my points once again. First of all, we see alliance politics is some sort of an anchor of a regional order. U.S., to be honest, whatever we argue with each other, is indispensable power from China. I hope the same logic also could be very powerfully appealing to our American friends. Then, given this, what just always dominates our interest and the calculation? People's better off. Let's have a sustained, economic prosperity. So Chinese-Aussie relations prove that if we can really align, not just diplomatically, but also economically and socially, then our relations has never been stronger and more persistent. So then, the same question we also ask Chinese: what's the best defense for China? Yes, we have one experimental, aircraft carrier. It's a sitting duck. I don't think some sort of aircraft carrier will be answer to the Chinese security. Most important things maybe for China's better security is twofold. One is, to what extent the U.S. would like to take China as airlines. If the Washington, Beijing could become the airlines, then all the security tension will just vanish overnight. But do you think that possible? Yes. Some people, just like me, cynically thinking the best defense for China is airline United States. But I have to say, no way. If we do that, then the rule of the game completely changed. So then my last point is, whatever we can just hedging against each other, we can just do some things, just serve our cause and keep both sides on vigil. But the basic formula to get the U.S. or China completely indispensable is this: maybe let's prepare for the worst, but we should always hope for the best. Thanks.
To be fair, I should note that you also defied the Australian bill, and the idea of China and US forming a natural alliance might be frightening for all the rest of us. Catherine's easing for the motion.
I was particularly taken with the question from Ms McIntosh about what are our own moral issues? What do we hold dear as Australians, as citizens of the world? And I would actually say that most of those issues, such as the rule of law, a democratic government, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of liberty, we hold in common with the US. That is why our alliance is so strong. Do we cross into reliance? I think sometimes we probably do. But then again, we are also able to step back and say, no, we don't want to do that. We don't need to do that. We are happy for you to do that. Go nuts. But it's not Australia's cup of tea, because we have an alliance. We don't have a master-slave relationship with the US. It is two stable economies, governments, and democracies coming together in the same interest, and hopefully in pursuance of the same goals that we all hold dear, that we all hold true. I don't think that Australia aligning itself with the US attracts more enemies. I think we attract enemies based on our way of life, which in many ways is similar to the US. We hold these same values and ideals dear and true. So these threats will come to us regardless of our alliance or reliance on the US. There are people and causes out there that do not agree with the way that we live our lives, and I don't think that the alliance with the US really has any bearing on that. The US alliance, I think, brings more pros than cons to our lives as Australians and as citizens of the world.
Thank you. Speaking against the motion, Jim Molan.
Thanks, Simon. You may be aware that ambassadors are sent overseas to be polite for their country. And the ambassador was very, very polite to us. It has happened. We are free riding. We have been free riding for a long time, and we will free ride into the future. We are spending 1.58% of our GDP, and both parties agree that they should be spending 2% of GDP. 2% would get us the force, if you spent it for long enough, would get us the force that would enable us to accept the fact that the US will act in its own interests, but if we ever want to act in our interests, we've got the ability to do it. The US is not evil, but it will operate in its own interests, and it has on occasions, and in relation to Australia, and they've been different from Australia. That people used to say the problem with Africa is that there's not enough US imperialism. Now, it seems to have worked its way out of that situation, but interests are everything. If we want to work in our own interests, we need to give ourselves the ability to do that.
Thank you.
You've been listening to highlights of last Thursday night's Intelligence Squared debate that the US alliance is our best defence. Our thanks tonight to the speakers on the affirmative, US Ambassador to Australia, Jeffrey Bleish, and Catherine Ziesing, editor of the Australian Defence Force magazine. For the negative, retired Major General Jim Molan and Professor Zhu Feng, Deputy Director of the Centre for International and Strategic Studies at Peking University. And now to the results. As you may know, at each Intelligence Squared debate, the audience is polled both before and after the debate. Pre-debate, it was pretty evenly split. Undecideds 34%, for the proposition that the US alliance is our best defence 36%, and against 30%. And after the debate, the undecideds were at 10%, for 36%, against 54%. This Intelligence Squared debate was presented by the St James Ethics Centre, thanks to the chair and moderator, Simon Longstaff. And that's it for Big Ideas for tonight. Tomorrow night, a forum on us.
There you go. The audience agrees with me. The US alliance is not the best course ahead for Australia. If we want to live on this landscape, we have to stop binding and tying the mouths and the feet of the kind who tread the grain to the interests of people overseas. This nation was built in order to profit overseas investors, the British Empire. My ancestors came here to grow grain and ship wool to Europe to feed the European market demand. When Singapore fell, the Australian government panicked and sucked up to the Americans, and then they didn't want to believe the American intelligence, which was that the Japanese considered Australia not worth invading because they had their army tied up in China and they didn't have the maritime services to feed their existing Pacific conquests, let alone entertain the idea of invading Australia. Therefore, the Australian government pretended that Japan was going to invade Australia. Thus, and because, we're still stuck in the American alliance. Fear of the yellow peril. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. I hope you enjoyed tonight's ABC Radio 1 Hour documentary. Ciao.